Right, so here we are, the fourth and final part of the servicing videos for the Royal Enfield Interceptor 650. And once we've got this out of the way, we can get onto the good stuff, accessories and other bits and pieces. The interesting stuff. Now, when a dealership gets your bike for service, they haven't seen the bike since they sold it to you or since its last service. So in an ideal world, a diligent dealership should carry out all these checks and procedures. In reality, I would be surprised if they do more than half of them, especially when you consider some of the items that I actually snagged when I received the bike, the things that should have been spotted on the PDI, just badly routed cables and wires, that kind of thing. Now, you pay for a PDI just like you pay for a service. Again, it's one of those things that's factored into the retail cost of the bike. And to my mind, if they haven't snagged these things on the PDI, they're probably not going to snag them on the service either. And this is why I prefer to do servicing myself. At least you know that it's done properly and everything's been checked. Whereas with most dealerships, it's a bit of a lottery. Now, as I've said, it's the first time a mechanic will have seen the bike since either it was sold or since its last service, so he has to assume the worst. When you're carrying this work out, on the other hand, you're riding this bike hopefully every day or at least a few times a week. You're familiar with it, and some of these things probably aren't necessary because in essence a lot of them are just pre-ride checks, things that you should be paying attention to and if necessary adjusting on a day-to-day basis of living with the bike, of using the bike. But I promised we would go through the entire service schedule, so that's what we're going to do. Let's get on with it. Now, we've already done the oil and filter change, the tappet adjustment, we've checked all the brake line unions on the ABS unit underneath the tank because we had the tank off, and we've checked and adjusted the chain. Those things are done and out of the way on part 1, 2 and 3. What we're going to cover today are basically just checks to make sure everything else, either since the last service or during the first few hundred miles of the bike's life, that may have come out of adjustment or need checking to make sure that they're bedded in properly. Right, first things first, lighting. And surprisingly, the service schedule doesn't mention checking your lighting, but your lighting is a very important part of the bike's operation. It allows you to see where you're going, it allows other road users to see where you are, and things like your indicators and your brake lights are crucial to letting other road users know what you're about to do or what you're doing. So switch your engine on, check your dip beam and your main beam, check the operation of your indicator switch and the operation of your indicators left and right, front and rear. Check that your tail light is illuminated, and then check that the brake light operates independently both with your front brake and your rear brake, and also check that your horn's working. Really nice horns on the Interceptor, by the way. Best motorcycle horns that I've ever come across. Then turn your attention to all your electrical cables that come from your switch housings down behind your forks. Don't worry about your brake hoses at this stage or your clutch and throttle cable. You need to check the routing of these cables thoroughly. Turn the steering from lock to lock and check to see what they do. You need to make sure that there's no undue tension being put against any of them. You also need to make sure that they're not chafing against any sharp surfaces that long term are going to cause them any damage. And obviously at this time you need to check to make sure that no damage has occurred during those first few hundred miles. There are some cables clips which are designed to hold things together and keep everything safe. When I took delivery of the bike, one of these was actually right under the tank, only connected to one cable, something that the PDI had missed. Check for these cable clips and make sure that they're in an optimal position to keep everything safe and to stop damage occurring to your wiring. When you've done that, check your throttle for operation. Wind the throttle grip as far back as it'll go, then let go to it. Make sure that it snaps back cleanly without banding or catching on anything, and that it's operating correctly. Then turn your attention to your clutch lever. Now, the manual says that there should be 2 to 3 millimeters free play in the clutch lever before it actually starts to pull the clutch cable. And you measure this at the actual lever itself, where the lever meets the lever mount. When there's no pressure on your clutch cable, both of these surfaces should meet. then if you take hold of your clutch lever and gently, very carefully start to pull it in, there will be a gap, an amount of free play before it actually starts to pull the clutch cable. That's your free play zone. Now, if you stand opposite the left-hand side of your handlebars, facing the adjustment wheel, anti-clockwise will loosen it off, so it will make the free play gap bigger. Turning it clockwise will tighten it up, making the free play gap smaller. I purposely slackened it off here to about 5mm just to demonstrate how to adjust it, and then I tightened it up in increments to about 2.5–3mm, which is what Royal Enfield say it should be. Now, the actual clutch itself shouldn't need adjusting at this stage, it should be fine for some thousands of miles, so I'm not going to go into that. That's an entire video all by itself. Just one useful tip with this: the slot that runs along one side of the adjuster, if you can, always try and finish with that facing downwards. That way, if the bike is caught in the rain, the water's not going to go into that slot and then run down the inside of your clutch cable and rust it up. When you're finished, check your clutch for operation, make sure that it's smooth, free of any snags, free of any glitches, and let's move on to the HT leads. Now, this is important because there was a problem with mine, and since taking delivery of this bike, I've had 3 reports of similar incidents. On 2 occasions, the bike completely broke down because of it, and again, this is down to PDIs not being done properly. Within a couple of minutes of taking delivery of this bike, I noticed that the HT lead was pressed up against the bottom seam of the petrol tank. It was pressed up against it hard. Now, I tried to replicate it for this video, but unfortunately, because I had rerouted it, I couldn't get it to go back in the position that it had been in when I took delivery. Now, what had happened on the occasions that were reported to me, and I saw that this could be a potential problem, was that that sharp edge at the bottom seam of the tank had worn through the insulation on the HT lead. Then the metal in the HT lead had worn through the paint on the tank and there'd been a short circuit. Now, on both occasions, it didn't cause a fire, but it did cause a complete meltdown of the ignition system, causing the bikes to break down. The other occasion, thankfully, it was noticed and a temporary repair was made and it was taken back to the dealership for some attention. Keep an eye on these both when you take delivery and when you do any servicing and any other time that you remember to look. There's absolutely no excuse for a bike getting through a PDI with a defect like that. Never trust your dealer to do the right thing. Next up, check both brake fluid reservoirs to make sure that the brake fluid level is where it should be. This shouldn't have changed much since the bike was new. If it's dropped a lot, it's an indication that there may be a leak somewhere. If the level in both reservoirs is correct, check all the unions connected up to the reservoirs to make sure that there's no leakage. We already checked the linkages to the ABS system underneath the tank, but don't forget that that does need to be checked. I think there was 3 or 4 unions there. Trace the lines along, checking every connection, finishing at the caliper. If you do find any evidence of weeping, it may be just a case of tightening the union up slightly, but don't go mad. Then have a look at the brake pads. Now, at your first service, there should be no appreciable wear. Just check that there's plenty of meat on them and that they're evenly seated on the discs on both sides. Then check your discs for scoring. Now, some marks are normal. You'll be able to feel these with your fingernails, but you shouldn't be able to feel them with your fingers. There should be no deep grooves that you can feel with the skin of your fingers. If there are any deep grooves or scoring, it needs investigating. If everything's okay, what I would suggest is a quick clean with a brake cleaner. I use the combined Silcoline brake and chain cleaner. During that initial bedding in period, more material than is usual is worn off the pads and the disc, which creates a lot of dust, and it's a good idea at the first service to just get rid of some of that brake dust. You don't want it building up and jamming the works at some later stage. So clean your caliper, and your disc and your braking system should be good to go now until the next service. Suspension. Check all your seals on your front forks, looking for any visible damage, also looking for any evidence that there may be suspension fluid leaking out. Also check the stanchions for any stone chips, scoring or pitting. Hopefully you won't find anything on your first service. Rear shock absorbers as well. They work on very similar principles to the front forks. Check for any evidence of suspension fluid leaking out, uneven wear or visibly damaged seals. Then it's time to check your tyres. Check for any damage that the tyres may have picked up on the road and also examine them to make sure that they are wearing evenly. Check your tyre pressures and, if necessary, reinflate them to the specified pressures. Make a visual check of all your spokes, looking out particularly for any that might be slightly bent or out of true. Go around with your fingers and check them all for tightness. Now, I know there is a method of using some sort of device to tap on each one, a bit like a tuning fork, to listen out for any differences in tone that might indicate that some spokes are looser than others. Unfortunately, that doesn't always work, because the person that originally built and trued this wheel may have had to leave some spokes looser than others in order to keep it true. Spin the wheels, check for run out, any evidence of buckling, and to be honest, that is about all you can do. If you do find anything that worries you, take it to a dealer. Right, the last two major things to check, and then we're almost there. Play in the steering head and play in the rear swing arm. To check for play in the steering head, take the bike off its stand and sit on it. Apply the front brake very gently. You don't want to lock the wheel up altogether. You just want to apply a little bit of friction to the disc, and then slowly and gently rock the bike backwards and forwards, listening for any clunking or clicking from the steering head. I emphasise do this very gently. You don't want to be compressing the forks with each motion and causing too much movement, because it is going to distract you from what you're looking for. If necessary, place your fingers where the steering head meets the yoke, and if there is any play, you should be able to feel it. If everything's as it should be, it's time to move to the rear swing arm. Put your bike back on the main stand and go to the back of the bike. Take a firm hold of the back wheel, brace your other hand against the seat, and then try to move the wheel from side to side. Look out for any sideways movement with the rear swing arm, and listen for any evidence of clicking or clunking. And if everything's nice and tight as it should be, it's time for a last cursory check. Go around all rubbers and hoses, including the hoses to your oil cooler. Check for cracks, check for hoses that are not seated properly, clips that are not applied properly. Check to make sure that nothing's kinked, and especially around the oil cooler, make sure there's no oil escaping from the joints. Now, the manual says at this point to go around the entire bike and check all fasteners for tightness. The only way you can really do that is to unfasten every single nut and bolt and then retorque them. That would take hours and hours to do. I would suggest common sense prevails here. A cursory look around the bike. The manufacturer did put some true marks on most of the fasteners. Just check to see if any of those have moved out of alignment, and that should be enough. Then last but not least, lubrication. It's up to you what type of grease you use. I like to use a calcium based white grease. I use the aerosol type. This stuff has excellent lubrication properties. It's also very resistant to wash off. It's used a lot in the marine industry. All pivoting joints should be given a dressing of grease, so that includes your side stand pivot, your centre stand pivot, your passenger and your rider's foot pegs, your rear brake lever pivot and your control levers. This grease is really good stuff. Because of the way it works, it penetrates before it sets. Just wipe off any excess and you're good to go for another 6,000 miles. The manual does mention about ensuring that the terminals on the battery are adequately greased up. I've got to admit, I was running out of time. I didn't have a look at that. But other than that, I don't think I've missed anything out. If I have, I'm sure there'll be some jobs worth watching that'll be willing to jump onto the comments section and let me know. So that is pretty much the end of part 4. All 4 parts covering the entire first service and the majority of the 6,000 mile services. Just bearing in mind that at certain mileages there are other things that need doing. Now remember, if you're doing this work yourself, there is absolutely no need to do it all in one day. You can spread it over 2 or even 3 days, or even 4 if you want. The main thing is that you take your time and you do it properly. And you'll also have the satisfaction of knowing that it's been done properly, rather than having those nagging doubts as to whether your dealership has done everything that they should be doing. Now, people keep asking me about how this affects the warranty of the bike. In the UK and the EU, There are laws in place that stipulate that a manufacturer or an importer cannot dictate where the servicing is done as long as the servicing is done properly. To be quite honest, I've spoken about this in the past. I don't put an awful lot of weight on warranties. Again, if you live in the UK or the EU, you're protected by the Consumer Rights Act, which is far more powerful than any warranty any manufacturer offers. And I think in a lot of respects, manufacturers and dealers tend to blind you with the warranty to take your attention away from what your statutory rights are. Now, it might be that you don't have the confidence to do certain aspects of this servicing. One thing that springs to mind is perhaps the tappet adjustment. If that's the case, do the rest of the work yourself and take it into a dealership for your tappets to be done. Now, I may not be able to find the exact type of weight grease that I use on Amazon, but I'll have a look on Amazon and I'll find a cheapest alternative. They are all pretty much the same. Once again, thanks very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this series and that you found it useful. If you have, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. I haven't got a clue what I'm doing next week, but I will be back next week. So until then, ride safely and I'll see you soon.